The 1,300 rooms of Hampton Court are full of centuries of history, from Henry VIII and his 6 wives to Elizabeth I. Some even claim ghosts walk its corridors. State apartment warder Errol Clayton is on his way to what is said to be the scariest part of the palace.
The palace has a long history, some grand and good, but some quite tragic and unfortunate. There are those, both visitors and staff, who claim to have seen things in the palace, from white spectres moving down staircases to malevolent spirits in the Georgian apartments. And because of that, the atmosphere, it can be very creepy when you're here on your own.
But Hampton Court's most notorious and terrifying ghost story is set in the appropriately named Haunted Gallery, where visitors and staff have reported seeing the spirit of another Tudor queen, Henry VIII's 5th and youngest wife, Catherine Howard.
It's on this gallery that the spectre of Catherine Howard comes running, screaming for her life, and knocks on that door there. This is where the most amount of sightings have been reported. This is where more people have fainted than anywhere else in the palace. Hence why we call it the Haunted Gallery. There's an uneasiness about the building, particularly in this corridor. Everybody who works in this area knows about it. You'll also get asked about it a lot during the day. If I ever saw Catherine Howard running towards me down the corridor, or even heard her screaming, I think it would be absolutely terrifying.
Rewind the clock 500 years, and King Henry VIII was tiring of his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. His eye had alighted on Anne's teenage lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. Historic Royal Palace's chief curator, Tracy Borman, has been researching Catherine's story.
Compared to Anne of Cleves, Catherine was younger, prettier, very vivacious and full of life, and she had a lot of admirers at court. Descriptions of her say that she had auburn hair, a curvaceous figure, sparkling eyes. So really, there's no wonder that she caught Henry's eye.
Henry made no secret of his infatuation for Catherine, and, despite still being married to Anne of Cleves, showered the teenager with gifts of land and expensive clothing.
To all the courtiers here, it must have been a pretty grim sight to see the king with his new love, Catherine Howard. He was much older than her, and by now he was well past his physical best. He'd put on a colossal amount of weight. He had these ulcerated legs that it was said you could smell from 3 rooms away. Not a very appealing suitor. We have this quite revealing description by someone who was there to witness all of this, quite a horrified ambassador who says, "The king is so amorous of her that he cannot treat her well enough and caresses her more than he did the others." So clearly people are disgusted by this. It does kind of make your flesh crawl to think of Henry leching over this young girl.
Catherine had gained her place in the royal household thanks to her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who saw her as a match for the king.
What must Catherine herself have been thinking? I mean, she could hardly have been attracted to Henry, but perhaps she was attracted by the huge honour of being Queen of England. But then I wonder how much choice she had in the matter. Throughout her life, she'd been controlled by her ambitious family, particularly the men in her family, and it was they who were now pushing her in the path of the king.
Henry just couldn't wait. He annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves, and 3 weeks later, he was married to Catherine Howard. But his happiness wasn't to last. Back in 1541, time was running out for King Henry VIII's young wife, Catherine Howard. She was facing scandalous accusations of adultery with 2 lovers. Henry had ordered a full investigation. If she was found guilty, Catherine could be executed.
It was in this suite of rooms that she was finally confronted with the allegations, where she had already been a nervous wreck, and this just pushed her over the edge. She became absolutely hysterical. I feel full of pity for Catherine at this stage. She knew how terrible the allegations were, but she also knew the truth of them too. Her only hope of survival was to reach the king and beg him to forgive her.
But Henry was furious with her.
Catherine ran screaming along this corridor, desperate to reach this doorway here. She knew that on the other side of it was her husband, the king. He was at prayer in the chapel, so tantalizingly close. But if he heard her screams, he ignored them. The guards seized Catherine, took her back to her apartments to face her interrogators all alone. This is the council chamber where Catherine's interrogators met to discuss tactics. This is a very dark and quite oppressive room. You can still feel the atmosphere. It gives me a bit of a chill being in here. And you can imagine Catherine waiting beyond this chamber, just gripped by fear and panic.
Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had informed the king of the rumours about Catherine, was one of her inquisitors. He had planned to question her severely, but on seeing the young queen, he found her distraught and lost.
Original descriptions of Catherine's interrogation make it clear just what a state she was in, and my heart goes out to her. She's not prepared for any of this. Well, Archbishop Cranmer was probably one of the kindest interrogators. He describes, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature. It would have pitied any man's heart in the world to have looked upon her." It must have been terrible for Catherine. Yes, she was Queen of England, but she's also just a frightened teenager, and she's surrounded by all these seasoned politicians who know exactly what it's going to take to bring her down.
As her interrogation continued, Catherine desperately tried to shift the blame from herself to others, but to no avail.
Technically, I suppose Catherine was guilty because of her past. She certainly wasn't a virgin when she married the king, and she'd had this adulterous affair afterwards. But it seems very obvious to me that she'd had no control over any of it. Throughout her life, she'd been preyed upon by the men around her. They'd used her for their own ends. She'd been forced, perhaps she'd even been raped, as she claimed. So you cannot but pity her, really.
Catherine knew that her only hope of survival was to appeal to her husband, the king, and since she could not see him, she wrote him a letter.
She threw herself on Henry's mercy, describing herself as the most vile wretch in the world. I find this letter really heartbreaking because she knows she's nearing the end of her life. She hasn't really got any other cards left to play. Her only chance of survival is to plead with Henry to remember what she once was to him and not what she's since become.
But it didn't work. After questioning, Catherine signed a full confession to her crimes. She was executed at the Tower of London on the 13th of February 1542, less than 2 years after she married Henry.